December 16, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The dawn came late that morning, filtered through a low, iron sky. Snow hung in the air like dust over the frozen trees, muffling every sound. The forest was eerily still, too still. American soldiers, stretched thin across a 70-mile front, stamped their boots and rubbed their hands for warmth. Many had grown complacent. This was the quiet sector, where weary men came to rest after months of fighting. In the town of Lanzerath, a handful of scouts from the 99th Infantry Division watched the tree line, unaware that within those woods 200,000 German troops and over 1,000 tanks were waiting for the signal to strike. Private First Class John L. MacArthur leaned against a frost-covered truck, eyes heavy from another night of bitter cold. "If this is winter in Belgium, I'd rather take a foxhole in hell." His friend laughed weakly, pulling his scarf tighter. They were miles from the front lines, or so they thought. Then, at 5:30 a.m., the forest erupted. A thunderous artillery barrage shattered the silence, 1,600 German guns firing almost in unison. Shells screamed through the fog, bursting among the trees, tearing branches and bodies apart alike. Communication lines were cut instantly. Entire American outposts disappeared in a hail of fire. The German counteroffensive had begun. Under the codename Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, Adolf Hitler had staked his last hope on a desperate gamble. The goal? To split the Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a peace on his own terms. It was an audacious plan, one that depended on total surprise. And for the first few hours, it worked. Columns of German Panther and Tiger tanks rolled out of the mist, their engines growling through the snow. Elite SS Panzer divisions, including Kampfgruppe Piper, led the assault. Soldiers wore white camouflage and spoke rehearsed English phrases to confuse checkpoints. They struck deep into the American lines, moving fast and brutal.
At first, many U.S. troops didn't believe it was real. Some thought the artillery was a local raid, others a mistake. But as the radio reports began to pour in, outposts overrun, convoys ambushed, tanks sighted everywhere, the realization hit like the cold. Germany wasn't retreating anymore. It was attacking. In the chaos, communication faltered. The dense forests and heavy fog grounded Allied air support, leaving frontline units blind. Entire divisions, like the 106th Infantry, found themselves encircled before noon. By midday, the snow turned red. Sergeant William, or Bill Walker, of the 2nd Infantry Division, remembered it later. "We were told to hold the line, then the line disappeared. There was no front anymore, just fire, smoke, and men running in every direction." Behind the German front, Hitler's generals, Sepp Dietrich, Hasso von Manteuffel, and Walter Model, drove their men forward. Each believed this offensive could change everything. If they could take the bridges at the Meuse River, if Antwerp could be seized before the Allies regrouped, they might fracture the Western Front completely. But it was a race against time and fuel. The German advance depended on capturing Allied gasoline dumps. Without them, their tanks would grind to a halt in the snow. Still, for now, momentum was on their side. As night fell, the Ardennes burned. Thousands of Americans were missing, captured, or dead. The roads were clogged with fleeing convoys. And in Bastogne, a small crossroads town soon to become legendary, the 101st Airborne was digging in, preparing to be surrounded. Far to the west, in his headquarters, Eisenhower received the first fragments of news. A surprise attack, heavy armor, complete confusion. His staff couldn't believe it. The war, they thought, was almost over. But in the frozen forests of Belgium, A new nightmare had begun.
December 17th, 1944, near St. Vith, Belgium. Morning came shrouded in fog, a thick gray curtain that clung to the frozen ground and turned sound into whispers. It was impossible to tell where the front line was anymore. Roads were clogged with wrecked trucks, overturned jeeps, and the frozen bodies of men who had been caught in the open when the artillery hit. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bud Harper of the 33rd Infantry surveyed what was left of his command post. His radio operator was gone, killed in the first barrage. The field phone lines had been cut. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the German armor was moving again. He could hear it, the low mechanical growl of engines echoing through the valley. "What are they doing here?" his adjutant asked, voice shaking. "We're 50 miles from the front." Harper didn't answer. He knew the truth. The front was gone. Throughout the Ardennes, similar scenes played out. American soldiers, cooks, drivers, clerks, men never meant to see combat were suddenly thrust into the fight. Entire units were scattered, communications shredded by the German blitz. The offensive had hit with terrifying precision, like a hammer through glass. The roads that wound through the forests, narrow, icy, and twisting, became death traps. Tanks and trucks skidded into ditches, blocking routes of retreat. German paratroopers in captured U.S. uniforms sowed chaos behind the lines, giving false orders, changing road signs, and ambushing convoys. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some swore that the Germans had landed paratroopers in Paris, others that Eisenhower himself had been captured. Panic was a weapon, and Hitler's troops used it well. At Malmedy, tragedy struck. A column of American prisoners from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, over 100 men, were rounded up by SS troops under Joachim Peiper's command. Forced into an open field, they were machine-gunned without warning. Those who tried to flee were hunted down and shot in the snow. Only a handful survived to tell the story. The Malmedy massacre would become one of the darkest episodes of the war in Western Europe, and a rallying cry for vengeance among Allied troops.
Meanwhile, in Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his 101st Airborne Division were racing to set up defenses. Bastogne wasn't just another Belgian town, it was the key crossroads of the Ardennes. Every road the Germans needed passed through it. The paratroopers arrived with little winter gear, low on ammunition, and no clear orders, but they dug in anyway. The temperature had dropped to freezing, and the snow was knee-deep in places. They wrapped their feet in burlap, used spare cloth as gloves, and waited for the storm to hit. Back at SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower and his senior commanders faced the unimaginable. Reports were inconsistent, scattered, and sometimes contradictory. The Germans had launched a massive attack through the Ardennes, a place long considered too rough for armor. "How the hell did they manage this?" Patton growled, slamming his hand on the table. His Third Army was positioned to the south, still pushing eastward. Eisenhower stared at the map. The red arrows marking the German advance were spreading like a blood stain across Belgium. "Intelligence failed," he said quietly. "We thought they couldn't do it. No fuel, no reserves, no air support. We were wrong." It was a rare admission. The Allies had believed that the German army was broken, incapable of large-scale offensives. But in the forests of the Ardennes, Hitler had gathered his last reserves, veterans, new recruits, even boys from the Hitler Youth, and thrown them into one final gamble. Yet as the Germans surged forward, cracks were already forming. Their columns moved slowly through the icy terrain. Fuel shortages forced them to abandon vehicles by the roadside. And as the weather began to clear, the skies, once their ally, would soon turn against them. Still, for the soldiers trapped in the snow, those were distant hopes. In Bastogne, the paratroopers could already hear the distant rumble of tanks.
The siege was about to begin.
December 19th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The snow came down in thick, silent sheets, swallowing the landscape whole. The men of the 101st Airborne huddled in their foxholes, breath steaming in the frigid air, rifles clutched tight. The distant rumble of engines grew louder by the hour, German armor grinding its way closer. Private First Class Jack O'Leary peered through a break in the trees, his frozen fingers gripping binoculars. He could see movement, a column of tanks and infantry approaching through the mist. He whispered into his radio, "They're coming." Within minutes, Bastogne was under siege. The town, a modest collection of stone houses and narrow streets, sat at the junction of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the entire Ardennes. McAuliffe's 101st Airborne, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division and a scattering of engineers, clerks, and medics, were tasked with holding it at all costs. By the evening of the 20th, the Germans had fully encircled the town. The weather grounded Allied aircraft. Supply drops couldn't get through. The men were low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Inside a makeshift command post, the basement of a battered building, General McAuliffe stood hunched over a map, lit by a single flickering lantern. Around him, his officers waited for orders. Outside, the ground shook with artillery. A staff sergeant burst in, clutching a sheet of paper. "Sir, message from the German commander." McAuliffe took the note, read it once, then smirked. It was an ultimatum, a demand for surrender. The Germans promised annihilation if the Americans didn't comply. He looked up, eyes gleaming. Aw, nuts. The room went silent. Then, realizing he was serious, the men broke into nervous laughter. The official typed reply sent back to the German commander read simply, "To the German commander, nuts." The American commander. It was defiance distilled to a single word. The next days were a blur of fire and frost. German artillery pounded the town relentlessly, reducing buildings to rubble. Wounded men filled every cellar and basement, tended by exhausted medics with dwindling morphine and bandages.
Corporal James Cavanaugh recalled years later, "The cold was worse than the shells. Your feet went numb first. Then the pain would come, like knives. We burned anything we could find to stay warm. Furniture, ammo boxes, even our own socks." Outside the perimeter, German infantry probed the defenses constantly. In the forests surrounding Bastogne, small unit skirmishes raged day and night. American paratroopers, many armed with little more than rifles and grenades, held off tanks with bazookas and sheer stubbornness. At one point, German armor broke through the line near Marvy, just south of the town. The defenders, a handful of paratroopers from Easy Company and a few tank destroyers, fought house to house, firing at point-blank range. When it was over, the street was littered with burning vehicles and bodies frozen in the snow. The siege dragged on, but the men refused to yield. Even as rations ran out, even as frostbite set in, morale held firm. Word of McAuliffe's famous reply spread through the ranks like wildfire, lifting spirits. Meanwhile, far to the south, General George S. Patton was already moving. His Third Army, pivoting north in a maneuver so fast it stunned even his staff, was racing toward Bastogne through ice and snow. Patton had promised Eisenhower he could relieve the town within 3 days, a claim many thought impossible given the conditions. But Patton's men drove through the frozen countryside, clearing mines, shoving vehicles out of ditches, and fighting off ambushes as they went. By Christmas Eve, the men in Bastogne could hear faint artillery to the south, friendly guns. Relief was coming.
That night, as the church bells of Bastogne rang faintly through the smoke and snow, soldiers crouched in the ruins shared what little they had: a can of beans, a cigarette, a joke about the cold. For them, Christmas 1944 was not about peace, it was about survival. And somewhere in the distance, under a black sky streaked with tracer fire, the tanks of the 4th Armored Division were closing in.
December 26, 1944, south of Bastogne, Belgium. The morning broke clear for the first time in over a week. The fog that had smothered the Ardennes lifted, revealing a landscape scarred by shell fire and blackened trees. In the distance, faintly at first, then unmistakably, came the low rumble of engines. Men of the 101st Airborne looked up from their foxholes, eyes wide. The sound grew louder, closer, and then they saw it. The white star painted on the front of a Sherman tank. Patton's 4th Armored Division had arrived. As the lead tanks rolled into Bastogne, cheers and shouts erupted across the lines. Exhausted paratroopers waved from their trenches, frostbitten hands raised in triumph. Some cried openly. Others simply collapsed in relief. For days they had been cut off, surrounded, and outgunned. But they had held. The siege of Bastogne was broken. Patton himself arrived hours later, his jeep splattered with mud and ice. He met McAuliffe amid the ruins of the town square, the church behind them still smoldering from artillery fire. Patton, in his trademarked ivory-handled revolvers, grinned broadly. "General, looks like you've been through hell." McAuliffe smiled wearily. "Just a little winter vacation, sir." The relief of Bastogne marked a turning point in the battle. The Germans had thrown their best units into the offensive, the 1st SS Panzer, the 2nd Panzer, the 116th Panzer, and the Volksgrenadiers. But now their momentum was stalling. Their fuel supplies were nearly gone, their lines stretched to the breaking point. And with the skies clearing, the full fury of Allied air power returned. From dawn to dusk, squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers roared over the snowfields, strafing and bombing German convoys. Roads that had been lifelines for the Wehrmacht became graveyards of twisted steel and fire. Tanks were blown apart, supply trucks incinerated, horse-drawn carts scattered across the frozen countryside. One American pilot later described it. "It was like hunting in a barrel. They couldn't move, couldn't hide. The snow reflected everything. We hit them again and again." The once mighty German armored spearhead began to wither. In the north, near St. Vith, American units that had been driven back regrouped and began counterattacks. In the south, Patton's divisions pushed relentlessly forward, squeezing the German Bulge from below. What had begun as a daring offensive was now turning into a desperate retreat. But for the men on the ground, victory came at a terrible cost. The forests were littered with the frozen bodies of soldiers from both sides. Entire villages had been obliterated. Civilians who had survived the initial onslaught now faced starvation and exposure. Farmers found their homes reduced to rubble, their livestock dead in the fields. In the small hamlet of Foy, just north of Bastogne, paratroopers fought from cellar to cellar, clearing houses filled with snipers. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. A single house might change hands 3 times in one day. The men who survived spoke of it for the rest of their lives, not with pride, but with a kind of haunted disbelief. By early January, the German High Command knew the offensive had failed. Their dream of capturing Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies was gone. The divisions that had once rolled west in triumph were now broken, starving, and running out of ammunition.
On January 3, 1945, Eisenhower ordered a full counteroffensive to erase the Bulge entirely. The snow returned, heavy and relentless, as the Allies advanced. Step by step, mile by mile, they clawed back the frozen ground. Villages like Uffalize, La Roche, and Wiltz were reduced to rubble and then liberated again. Every yard of progress was paid for in blood. By January 25th, the line had been restored. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II, was over. For Hitler, it had been a final throw of the dice. He had gambled everything, the last reserves of Germany's strength, on one audacious strike. And he had lost. The cost was staggering. Over 80,000 American casualties, and even more on the German side. The Wehrmacht's armored forces were shattered, its fuel gone, its will broken. From that moment on, Germany would never again launch a major offensive in the West. But for the men who survived Bastogne and the Ardennes, the memory of that frozen hell would never fade.
January 28, 1945. The Ardennes, Belgium. The snow still fell, covering the wreckage of the battlefield like a burial shroud. Frozen tanks lay scattered across the hills, their hulks blackened by fire, their crews still entombed inside. The smell of fuel and death lingered in the icy wind. For the men trudging through the snow, the survivors of the 101st Airborne, the 2nd Armored, and the 84th Infantry, victory was a quiet, hollow thing. They had held the line, broken the German assault, and saved the Western Front. Yet, as they marched through villages that no longer existed, there was little left to celebrate. Private Jack O'Leary, now gaunt and frostbitten, walked past a column of captured German soldiers. Some were little more than boys, faces pale, eyes empty. One clutched a photograph of his family, another stumbled barefoot in the snow. War, at last, was showing its true face. In a ruined farmhouse near Uffalize, General Eisenhower stood before a map with his commanders, Patton, Bradley, and Montgomery. The red bulge that had once threatened to split their lines was gone. "Gentlemen," Eisenhower said quietly, "this is the beginning of the end for Germany." He was right. The Battle of the Bulge had cost the Wehrmacht its last reserves of armor, fuel, and manpower. Entire divisions were annihilated. The SS Panzer units that had spearheaded the offensive were now shadows of their former strength, incapable of mounting another major attack. The failure of Hitler's offensive opened the path to the Rhine. Within 2 months, Allied forces would cross into Germany itself. The end of the war in Europe was now inevitable. But the victory had come at an immense price. Over 19,000 American soldiers had been killed, 47,000 wounded, and over 23,000 captured or missing. Civilian casualties across Belgium and Luxembourg numbered in the thousands. Entire towns were erased. The frozen fields of the Ardennes had become a graveyard. In Bastogne, the survivors of the 101st Airborne gathered in silence. Their faces were drawn, their eyes distant. Many could barely walk from frostbite. Others stood with missing fingers wrapped in bloody bandages. A chaplain read a short prayer over a line of wooden crosses hammered into the frozen ground. The wind carried his voice over the shattered town. "They fought for each other," he said, "and for the world to come. For many, that was the only solace left, Yet, even as the snow melted and the Allies pushed east, questions lingered. How had this happened? How had the Germans managed to launch such a massive surprise attack right under the nose of Allied intelligence? The truth was a mixture of arrogance and complacency. Allied command had assumed Germany was finished. Reports of enemy buildup in the Ardennes were dismissed as routine. Reconnaissance flights were limited due to bad weather, and frontline commanders were assured that the sector was quiet. The Germans exploited that blindness perfectly. Using strict radio silence and deception, they assembled one of the largest surprise offensives in modern history, right in the heart of the Allied line. In Berlin, Hitler refused to admit defeat. Furious and delusional, he blamed his generals for the failure, not his own reckless plan. But inside the high command, the truth was undeniable. The Reich was crumbling. General Guderian, inspecting the remnants of the panzer divisions, told a colleague, "We've lost the war. After the Ardennes, we have nothing left." And he was right. The German army, once feared across Europe, was now a spent force. When the Red Army began its massive push from the east a few weeks later, there would be no strength left to resist. Still, in the stories of those who fought and endured, the Battle of the Bulge became something greater than defeat or victory. It became a symbol of endurance, of defiance, of the will to stand firm when all hope seems lost. In later years, veterans would remember not the glory, but the cold, the endless snow, the fear, the silence after the shelling stopped. For them, the Ardennes was not a battle, it was a season of hell. But in that frozen nightmare, the Allies proved that even against the odds, even in the darkest winter, courage could hold the line. The Bulge had been broken, the road to Berlin lay open, and the world, finally, was turning toward dawn.